It didn't begin with fire, not with invasion, not with the thunder of armies breaking through the gates of Rome. It began with something far quieter, something so subtle that almost no one recognized it for what it was. Roman soldier returns home after 25 years on the frontier. His body carries the weight of winters spent in mud and blood, his armor worn thin by time. But in his hand, he holds certainty. A small leather pouch filled with silver coins, his reward, his future, his security, a lifetime of sacrifice. Compressed into metal, he walks into the marketplace expecting something simple. Bread, wine, stability, but something feels different. The baker doesn't smile. The merchant doesn't reach for the coins. There's hesitation, calculation, doubt. Prices have changed, not dramatically at first, just enough to feel inconvenient. A loaf of bread costs more than it did last month, then more than last week. The soldier frowns, adjusts, pays anyway, but then it happens. The same coins, no longer buy the same things, and no one can explain why. The metal hasn't changed. The emperor's face still stares back from its surface. The weight feels the same in his palm, but its power is gone. Now imagine that moment multiplied. Across an entire empire, merchants whispering in confusion, families stretching their savings thinner each day, traders refusing payment in coins they once trusted without question. Something invisible has broken. Rome, the most powerful economic system the world had ever seen, didn't collapse in a single moment. It unraveled quietly, like a thread pulled from a vast tapestry. At first, no one calls it collapse. They call it fluctuation, adjustment, a phase, because collapse doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as normal. The markets are still open. The streets are still crowded. The empire still stands. From a distance, everything looks intact, but beneath the surface, something fundamental has shifted. Trust, and once trust begins to erode, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. This is the part history rarely tells you, because when we think of collapse, we imagine destruction, cities burning, armies falling, chaos consuming everything. But the real collapse happens long before that. It happens when value itself begins to dissolve, when people wake up one day and realize that what they spent their entire lives building no longer holds meaning. And yet, here's where the story becomes unsettling. Because while millions of people experienced that loss while savings evaporated, wages became meaningless and entire livelihoods disappeared. Some people didn't just survive, they became richer quietly, systematically, almost invisibly, while the majority clung to a system that was slipping through their fingers. A small minority had already stepped outside of it. They weren't holding coins, they were holding something else, something that didn't depend on emperors, or policies, or the illusion of stability, something that didn't weaken when trust collapsed. This is the contradiction that sits at the center of Rome's fall. How can an economic collapse destroy wealth for millions, yet multiply it for a few? It shouldn't make sense, and yet it does, because what we call wealth is not as solid as we believe. Imagine a vast library, one that stores the value of an entire civilization. Every coin, every contract, every promise carefully recorded on its shelves. Now imagine that library catching fire, flames consuming knowledge, reducing certainty to ash. Everything people trusted disappearing in real time. But as the fire spreads, something strange happens. Not everything burns. A few books remain untouched. Not because they were protected, but because they were never flammable to begin with. Hidden within Rome's collapse were for such books. For assets that didn't just survive the destruction of the system, they existed outside of it. They followed different rules, deeper rules, rules that most people never think about until it's too late. And here's the unsettling truth. They were never secret. They were visible the entire time, but almost no one recognized their importance until the system began to fail. Because when everything is stable, people chase what feels powerful. But when everything breaks, power reveals itself differently. The things that seemed strong begin to collapse, and the things that seemed ordinary begin to endure. Which raises a question that reaches far beyond ancient Rome. If the most powerful empire in history couldn't protect wealth, what makes us believe our systems are any different? Because collapse doesn't arrive like a storm, it arrives like a shift, subtle, gradual, almost invisible, until one day the things you trust most no longer work the way they used to. And by then, the people who understood the pattern have already moved. They've already positioned themselves. They've already secured what survives. The only question is, will you recognize the pattern when it begins, or will you, like millions before you, realize it only after everything changes? To understand how Rome's economy collapsed, you have to stop imagining collapse as an event and start seeing it as a slow erosion that disguises itself as normal life. Because Rome did not fall the way cities fall in war films. There was no single moment where everything stopped, no dramatic announcement, no clear line between stability and chaos. Instead, there was continuity. Markets opened, taxes were collected, soldiers marched, emperors issued decrees. Life continued with the illusion of control, and that illusion is exactly what made the collapse so powerful at its peak. The Roman Empire felt unshakable. Roads connected distant provinces like veins in a living body. Grain flowed from Egypt, metals from Spain, luxury goods from the East. Rome didn't just govern territories, it orchestrated a global machine of extraction and distribution. From the outside, it looked permanent, but permanence is often the most dangerous illusion of all. Because beneath the surface of expansion, something was already shifting. Rome's economy was not built on balance, it was built on momentum. As long as the empire expanded, wealth flowed in. New territories meant new resources, new slaves, new taxes, new revenue streams. Expansion wasn't just political, it was economic oxygen. But what happens when expansion slows? That question didn't have an immediate answer. So Rome did what most systems do when they face uncertainty: they delayed it. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the foundation of its currency began to change. The silver content in Roman coins started to decrease. At first, it was negligible. A small reduction justified. By necessity, the empire needed more money to fund its armies, its bureaucracy, its borders stretching too far to defend cheaply. No one panicked because visually, nothing changed. The coins still looked the same. The emperor's face still carried authority. Transactions still happened every day in crowded markets, but beneath the surface, something essential was being diluted, like pouring water into wine. The appearance remained familiar, but the strength was fading. This is where the first paradox emerges. Rome did not collapse because people suddenly lost trust. It collapsed because trust eroded slowly enough that no one noticed it disappearing. Money is not valuable because of metal. It is valuable because of belief. A shared agreement, a collective illusion that this object represents something real, stable, and transferable. And once that belief begins to weaken, reality itself begins to shift. At first, people adjusted without resistance. Prices rose slightly. Then, more noticeably, merchants recalculated. Farmers adapted. Soldiers accepted delays in payment. Life continued, but with friction. Then came the second phase, adaptation. Some merchants stopped trusting coins altogether. They demanded payment in goods instead: grain, oil, livestock, anything tangible, anything that couldn't be diluted by imperial decree. Soldiers, once paid in silver, increasingly received land grants instead. Not because it was better, but because it was more stable. Land doesn't inflate. This shift was subtle, but it revealed something critical. People were beginning to lose faith in the system itself, and yet they did not call it collapse. They called it adjustment. That is how systems die while still appearing alive, because inside the empire, nothing looked broken. There were no empty cities, no immediate shortages everywhere, no dramatic breakdown that forced attention. Instead, there was normalization. Inflation became temporary. Currency debasement became policy. Economic instability became a phase. And this normalization is what allowed the system to continue long after its foundations had weakened. Here lies another paradox. Collapse is rarely experienced as collapse while you are inside it. It is only recognized in hindsight. For the average Roman citizen, life still had structure. They worked, they traded, they paid taxes. They adapted to each new change without fully questioning the direction of those changes, because humans are remarkably good at adapting to slow deterioration. What feels unbearable in theory becomes acceptable in practice. When it happens gradually enough, but beneath this adaptation, something deeper was happening. A silent divergence was forming within society. Those who depended entirely on the system, soldiers, bureaucrats, urban workers, were becoming increasingly vulnerable, while those who began stepping outside the system were becoming more stable. They didn't rely solely on coins. They diversified their value storage. They shifted into assets that were less dependent on imperial stability, not because they had foresight in a mystical sense, but because they were closer to the fractures. They saw the inconsistencies earlier. They felt the instability before it became visible in records. And so, without fanfare or recognition, a silent redistribution of security began. But to most people, nothing seemed unusual. The empire still existed. Emperors still ruled. The machinery still functioned. And that is what made the collapse so dangerous. Because systems do not fail when they stop working. They fail when they continue working, but no longer reliably. The illusion of continuity becomes more powerful than the reality of decay. And so Rome drifted forward, unaware that the very mechanisms designed to sustain it were accelerating its unraveling. Currency was no longer a stable anchor. It had become a moving target, and once money loses stability, everything built upon it begins to shift. Not suddenly, but inevitably. This is the moment in history where the invisible fracture begins to widen, and what comes next is not just economic breakdown, but systemic transformation. To understand why Rome collapsed, you cannot stay at the surface of emperors' battles or dates. Those are just outcomes. The real story is buried deeper in the invisible architecture of systems, because Rome was not just a political empire, it was a financial machine, a complex loop of incentives, extraction, and survival that depended on one fragile condition: continuous flow. As long as money, resources, and expansion moved in predictable directions, the system felt stable. But beneath that stability was something far more delicate than most people realized: a dependency loop. Taxation funded the military. The military secured territories. Territories generated wealth. Wealth funded more taxation. It looked like strength, but in reality, it was circular dependence disguised as power. And circular systems have one fatal weakness: they cannot stop moving without collapsing. At first, this loop worked because Rome was expanding. New lands meant new revenue streams. New populations meant new taxes. New resources meant new stability. But expansion is not a permanent condition. And when expansion slowed, the system did not adjust downward, it tried to compensate upward. This is where the first structural fracture appears. Rome's spending commitments, especially military, did not shrink when income slowed. Instead, they increased. Borders became harder to defend. Armies became more expensive. Administration became heavier. The empire stretched further than its ability to sustain itself. And so, the system turned to the easiest available solution. It changed the definition of money. Currency debasement was not a dramatic policy decision, was a quiet erosion. Each new coin contained slightly less silver than the last. At first, the difference was invisible, then measurable, then unavoidable. But here's the deeper mechanism. Rome wasn't just printing money, it was printing trust, because currency only functions if people believe it represents value. Once that belief weakens, every transaction becomes uncertain, and uncertainty spreads faster than policy can contain it. This is where systems begin to behave strangely. On the surface, everything still functions. Taxes are collected, soldiers are paid. Markets open each morning. The machinery of state continues to operate. But underneath, friction increases. Prices become unpredictable. Contracts become unstable. Trade becomes cautious. Every actor in the system begins to add risk buffers into their decisions, and those buffers accumulate slowly. Silently, the system becomes heavier to operate. Now comes the paradox that defines Rome's collapse. The empire did not fail because it stopped functioning. It failed because it kept functioning in ways that were increasingly unsustainable in response to instability. Rome introduced more control mechanisms. Price controls were enforced to stabilize. Inflation taxes were increased to cover deficits. Labor obligations were tightened to secure production. But each intervention created new distortions. Price controls discouraged merchants from selling, so goods disappeared from official markets. Higher taxes pushed people to hide wealth or avoid production entirely. Forced labor reduced efficiency and innovation. Every solution created a new problem. It was like tightening a machine that was already overheating. Instead of cooling the system, Rome was compressing it. And when systems are compressed under stress, they do not stabilize, they fracture internally. This is the hidden law of complex systems. Intervention does not always fix instability. Sometimes it accelerates collapse. Inside Rome, this meant something subtle but devastating was happening. People were no longer trusting the official economy. Not suddenly but gradually, they began to trade outside formal systems. They relied on personal networks instead of institutional guarantees. They shifted value into forms that could not be easily manipulated. This is what economists later call a shadow economy. But inside Rome, it was simply survival, and survival creates its own logic. When the official system becomes unreliable, people stop optimizing for efficiency and start optimizing for certainty. Certainty replaces growth as the primary goal, and that shift changes everything. Because once trust leaves the official system, the system itself begins to hollow out. Revenue declines. Enforcement weakens. Control becomes expensive. The state reacts by increasing pressure, which only accelerates avoidance. A feedback loop emerges but in reverse. Instead of reinforcing stability, the loop reinforces decline. This is where Rome crosses an invisible threshold, not a political threshold, systemic one. The point where corrective action no longer stabilizes the system, but destabilizes it further. And at this stage, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a trajectory. But here is the most unsettling part. From inside the system, nothing appears immediately catastrophic. There is no single moment where everything breaks. Instead, there is a gradual divergence between appearance and reality. On paper, the empire still functions in lived experience. It becomes increasingly unreliable. This gap is where perception fails, because humans interpret systems through visibility, not structure. And Rome still looked intact. Armies still marched. Emperors still ruled. Markets still opened. But beneath that continuity, the machine was no longer self-sustaining. It was being held together by increasing effort, decreasing trust, and compounding inefficiency, and every attempt to restore balance pushed it further out of equilibrium. This is the final irony of system mechanics. The more a failing system tries to preserve itself, the faster it reveals its instability. At this point, a second economy begins to form, not officially recognized, but functionally more reliable, and decentralized value storage, not because people planned it that way, but because necessity forced it into existence. And this hidden shift marks the beginning of something far more important than collapse itself. It marks the redistribution of resilience, because when systems fail, value does not disappear, it migrates, and those who understand where it migrates are the ones who survive what comes next. To understand why Rome's collapse mattered beyond its borders, you have to stop thinking of it as an isolated empire and start seeing it as a node inside a much larger living network, because Rome was never just Rome. It was the center of a vast, breathing web of trade routes, economic dependencies, and cultural exchanges stretching from the misty edges of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the Silk Roads of Asia to the Mediterranean, HEARTLANDS. For centuries. This network functioned like a circulatory system. Grain flowed inward from Egypt. Metals came from Spain. Luxury goods arrived from the East. In return, Roman coins, soldiers, law, and demand flowed outward. It wasn't just trade, it was synchronization, a global rhythm held together by trust in one central point, Rome itself. But here is the hidden vulnerability of any network built this way. When the center weakens, the entire structure does not collapse. Uniformly, it fractures unevenly. And that unevenness is where opportunity and chaos begin to mix. At first, the disruption was subtle. Trade did not stop, it redirected. Merchants, always the first to sense instability, began adjusting routes. Instead of moving goods through Roman-controlled channels, they began bypassing them. Local hubs gained importance. Smaller cities started becoming new centers of exchange. It was like watching a river system. During a geological shift, water does not disappear when blocked. It simply finds new paths, and those new paths create entirely new landscapes. This is where the paradox of collapse emerges. When a dominant system weakens, it does not erase wealth, it redistributes it. What Rome once centralized began to decentralize, and decentralization creates fragmentation, but also freedom, because now value is no longer locked inside one authority. It begins to move independently. Some regions adapted faster than others. Local economies that once depended heavily on Rome began forming their own internal systems of trust. Barter re-emerged in some areas. Regional currencies appeared in others. Trade alliances shifted based on practicality rather than imperial structure. And in this shifting landscape, something important began to happen. Wealth stopped being tied to Rome itself. It became tied to access, adaptability, and control over essentials. Not all assets were equally affected by this fragmentation. Some collapsed with the system. Others simply detached from it. This is where the idea of surviving assets becomes more than historical curiosity. Becomes a structural insight, because the assets that endured were not those most integrated into Rome's system, but those least dependent on it. Things like land that produced food regardless of currency fluctuations. Resources that retained utility even when political structures shifted. Goods and networks that operated through human necessity rather than imperial decree. These were not glamorous assets. They were not speculative. They were foundational. And that is exactly why they survived. Meanwhile, as central authority weakened, power did not disappear, migrated. Local leaders gained influence. Regional networks strengthened. Trade intermediaries became more important than central administrators. It was not collapse in the absolute sense, it was transformation through decentralization. But here is the subtle psychological shift that most people miss. From inside the system, this did not feel like opportunity, it felt like disorder, because humans are conditioned to interpret stability as safety, even when that stability is artificial. So when Rome began fragmenting, most people experienced it as loss. But from a structural perspective, it was redistribution, and redistribution always creates winners and losers simultaneously. This is where another paradox emerges. The same event that destroys centralized power often creates localized opportunity, but only for those positioned to recognize the shift. Merchants who adapted quickly began profiting from new trade routes. Landholders in stable regions gained influence as agricultural reliability became more valuable than currency. Local networks of trust replaced distant institutional guarantees. Value did not vanish. It simply changed form and direction. And this change happened slowly enough that most people did not recognize its significance until it was already complete. Because collapse does not travel evenly through a network. It moves like pressure through water, finding weak points, redirecting flow, reshaping structure as it goes. Rome's influence did not end everywhere at once. It receded like a tide pulling back from the shore, revealing new ground underneath, and on that newly exposed ground, new systems began to form. Smaller, less centralized, but more adaptive. This is where history becomes uncomfortable, because it reveals something counterintuitive about power. The strength of a system is not only in how well it holds together, but in how well its parts function when it no longer does. Rome's central structure failed, but its fragments became new centers of activity. And in that transition, wealth did not disappear, relocated. This relocation is the key to understanding what survived. Because what survives systemic collapse is rarely what is strongest during stability. It is what remains useful when stability disappears, and usefulness, unlike power, does not depend on authority. It depends on necessity. Food is necessary. Land is necessary. Shelter is necessary. Trade networks based on trust are necessary. These do not require imperial validation. To retain value, they require only human continuity. And, as Rome weakened, human continuity became more important than imperial structure. This shift quietly redefined what wealth meant across regions, no longer something stored in centralized systems, but something embedded in survival, access, and adaptability. And those who understood this shift early were no longer thinking in terms of empire. They were thinking in terms of endurance. Because when a system begins to fragment, the question is no longer, how do I preserve value? It becomes, where does value go when the center can no longer hold it? And the answer to that question would define who survived the collapse and who was consumed by it.